When we speak about history, we often imagine a complete record, dates preserved, events documented, voices remembered. Yet the honest student of the past quickly discovers that history is never as whole as it appears. What survives on the pages of textbooks is only a fraction of what was lived in reality. Entire experiences fade, not because they lacked meaning, but because power, politics, and perspective decided which memories deserved to endure. And it is within these silences that we begin to uncover what might be called the lost chapters of Jewish history. To understand this idea, we must first reflect on how collective memory is formed. Communities remember what helps them survive, what strengthens identity, what explains suffering, and what gives hope for the future. But memory is also shaped by those who hold authority, empires, institutions, and dominant cultures. When a people live for centuries as minorities, scattered across lands not fully their own, their stories often remain preserved in private spaces rather than public narratives. They are carried in prayers whispered at night, in traditions practiced quietly, in texts studied away from the centers of power. These are not absent histories, they are hidden ones. There is a psychological weight to being unseen in the story of humanity. Imagine generations growing up knowing their ancestors endured expulsions, discrimination, forced migration, and moments of profound resilience, yet finding only fragments of this reality, acknowledged by the wider world. This creates a tension between internal memory and external recognition. Internally, the story is vivid and sacred. Externally, it may appear distant or simplified. Over time, this gap shapes how a community understands itself and how others perceive it. The lost chapter, therefore, is not merely about missing information. It is about the emotional and spiritual consequences of being partially remembered. At the same time, we must recognize that forgotten narratives are not always erased intentionally. Sometimes history narrows simply because human attention is limited. The world moves from one crisis to another, one empire to the next, one revolution to another, and quieter stories disappear beneath louder events. Yet quiet does not mean insignificant. A small community preserving faith in exile, a family rebuilding life after displacement, scholars maintaining learning under oppression. These moments rarely dominate headlines, but they shape civilizations in ways far deeper than conquest or power ever could. This invites us to reconsider what we define as historical importance. Is history only the story of kings, wars, and borders, or is it also the story of endurance, belief, and moral struggle? When we search for the lost chapters of any people, including the Jewish experience, we are really asking a philosophical question: what does it mean for a human life to matter in the record of time? If suffering is ignored, does it become less real? If resilience is unnoticed, does it become less Arabic? Lif Arabic, Lam Arabic, Tain Arabic, Thought Arabic, yet Arabic, meme in meaning. The conscience knows the answer, even when the archive does not. There is also a moral dimension to rediscovering forgotten histories. Remembering is not a neutral act, it is an ethical one. To acknowledge pain that was overlooked is to restore dignity to those who carried it. To study resilience that went uncelebrated is to honor the strength that preserved identity against overwhelming odds. And in doing so, we begin to cultivate empathy, not the shallow empathy of temporary emotion, but the deeper empathy that reshapes how we see humanity itself. Yet this reflection is not only about the past. Whenever a story remains hidden, the present is affected. Misunderstanding grows where knowledge is absent. Stereotypes replace nuance. Distance replaces compassion. By bringing lost narratives into the light, we do more than correct history. We transform relationships in the present. We learn to see communities not as symbols or headlines, but as human beings with layered memories, fears, hopes, and faith. Perhaps the most profound lesson here is that disappearance from public history does not mean disappearance from reality. Truth has a way of surviving in the hearts of those who carry it. Even when ignored by the world, memory continues through teaching, ritual, and storytelling. And eventually, every hidden chapter seeks rediscovery because justice and truth are deeply connected. What is buried in one generation often rises in another, asking to be seen, understood, and honored. So the question before us is not only what was forgotten, but why remembering now matters. If we approach these histories with humility, we allow them to refine our moral vision. If we listen carefully, they teach us how fragile dignity can be and how powerful perseverance is. And if we truly absorb their lessons, we become less willing to ignore suffering anywhere, for any people, in any time. In the end, the lost chapter of history is also a mirror. It reflects how easily humanity overlooks the quiet struggles of others, and how urgently we are called to notice them. To recover forgotten stories is to recover a piece of our own conscience. And perhaps the real question is this: if we fail to remember the pain of the past, how will we ever recognize our responsibility in the present? If the first reflection invited us to notice what was forgotten, the next step is to understand the pattern that runs through what was remembered. When we look carefully across centuries of Jewish history, a striking rhythm appears: exile followed by rebuilding, loss followed by renewal, dispersion followed by the preservation of identity. This is not a simple historical observation. It is a psychological and spiritual pattern that tells us something profound about the nature of human endurance. Exile, in its deepest sense, is more than physical displacement. It is the experience of living between worlds, belonging partially, yet never completely, building a home while knowing it may not last, carrying memory as both comfort and burden. For many communities, a single exile would be enough to dissolve identity. Language fades, traditions weaken, and the next generation slowly blends into the dominant culture around them. Yet what makes the Jewish historical experience remarkable is not merely the repetition of exile, but the persistence of continuity despite it. This persistence forces us to ask an important question: what allows an identity to survive when land, power, and security are repeatedly taken away? Most civilizations anchor themselves in geography or political authority. Remove those foundations and the structure collapses. But here we see a different model, one rooted in text, ritual, law, and shared memory. When identity is written into daily life rather than tied only to territory, it becomes portable. It can cross borders, survive migrations, and outlive empires. Psychologically, this creates a people trained not only to endure hardship, but to transform hardship into meaning. There is also a paradox within repeated displacement. On the surface, exile appears purely tragic, and in many ways it is. Families are separated, livelihoods destroyed, dignity threatened. Yet history shows that within suffering, unexpected forms of strength can emerge. Communities in exile often develop deep intellectual traditions, strong social networks, and a heightened sense of moral responsibility. When survival cannot depend on force, it begins to depend on wisdom, discipline, and unity. Over generations, this reshapes character itself. But we must be careful not to romanticize suffering. The lesson is not that pain is desirable, nor that injustice is acceptable because resilience may follow. Rather, the lesson is that human beings possess a capacity placed within them by the Creator, a capacity to rebuild even when circumstances seem designed to break them. Recognizing this capacity should not make us tolerant of oppression. it should make us more determined to prevent it. Because every story of survival also contains a story of wounds that never should have existed, another dimension of this cycle is the preservation of hope. To live through repeated uncertainty without losing hope requires more than optimism. It requires faith in a moral order beyond immediate reality. Hope becomes an act of resistance. Teaching children the same prayers, the same stories, the same ethical responsibilities in every new land becomes a declaration that identity will not disappear. Philosophically, this transforms memory into a bridge between past and future. The past is not only remembered, it is carried forward as guidance. And this continuity does something powerful to the human psyche. It creates resilience that is not loud or dramatic, but steady and disciplined. The kind of resilience that wakes up each morning and chooses meaning again. The kind that studies, builds families, forms communities, and contributes to society even when society does not fully accept it. This quiet perseverance rarely attracts attention, yet it is one of the strongest forces in history. For us today, reflecting on these cycles is not merely an academic exercise. We live in a world where displacement, migration, and identity crises are once again widespread. Entire populations struggle with belonging, memory, and survival. By studying long histories of endurance, we gain insight into our present moment. We learn that identity rooted only in comfort is fragile, but identity rooted in purpose can survive storms. We learn that communities strengthened by values rather than privilege can outlast those built only on power. Most importantly, we are reminded that survival alone is not the final goal. The deeper question is what kind of moral and spiritual character emerges from survival. Does hardship produce bitterness or wisdom, isolation or empathy, despair or renewed commitment to justice? History presents both possibilities, and the choice ultimately belongs to each generation. So when we speak of exile and return, loss and renewal, we are not only describing one people's past. We are describing a universal human test. Every community, in its own way, will face moments where stability disappears and identity is questioned. In those moments, the examples left behind in history become signposts. They show that continuity is possible, that meaning can outlive suffering, and that faith, however one understands it, can transform survival into purpose. And perhaps this is the reflection we should carry forward. A people is not defined by how often it is displaced, but by what it refuses to forget while wandering. If memory remains alive, identity remains possible, and if identity remains grounded in moral purpose, then even the longest exile can become the beginning of return. As we continue this reflection, another difficult but necessary theme emerges, one that is not unique to a single people, yet becomes painfully clear when we study long histories of suffering. It is the silence of the world in moments when injustice is unfolding in plain sight. If exile teaches us about endurance, then silence teaches us about responsibility and sometimes about its tragic absence. History repeatedly shows that oppression rarely happens in complete secrecy. Warnings appear early. Voices cry out, signs become visible to those willing to see, and yet again and again, the response of the wider world is hesitation, calculation, or indifference. Political interests intervene, economic concerns delay action, moral clarity becomes clouded by convenience. By the time outrage becomes acceptable, the damage is already irreversible. This pattern forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Injustice is often sustained not only by the oppressor, but by the quiet of the observer. Psychologically, silence can feel safer than confrontation. To speak against wrongdoing carries risk, social, political, even personal. Remaining silent allows individuals and societies to preserve comfort, at least temporarily. But this comfort is fragile because suppressed conscience does not disappear, it lingers. Over time, silence transforms into regret, and regret into the haunting question of what might have changed if courage had come earlier. Entire generations can inherit this moral weight. There is also a philosophical dimension to collective silence. Every society claims to value justice, dignity, and human worth. These ideals appear in laws, speeches, and public declarations. Yet, the true measure of belief is not what is spoken in times of peace, but what is defended in times of crisis. When suffering is distant, principles are easy. When defending those principles requires sacrifice, hesitation begins. This gap between stated values and lived action reveals the fragile nature of moral commitment when it is not rooted deeply enough. But we must be careful here. The purpose of examining silence is not to assign blame to later generations who were not present, nor to simplify complex historical realities. Human societies are complicated, and decisions are rarely as clear in the moment as they appear in hindsight. Fear, misinformation, and uncertainty all shape behavior. Recognizing this complexity should produce humility in us. Yet, humility must not become an excuse for passivity. Understanding why silence happens should strengthen our resolve to resist it when our own moment arrives. Because every era has its test, we often imagine that moral courage belongs to heroic figures in distant history, but the truth is more demanding. The real test appears quietly in ordinary times, asking ordinary people whether they will notice suffering that does not directly affect them. Whether they will care enough to learn, whether they will risk comfort to defend principle. Most of history's silences were not created by monsters. They were created by average people convincing themselves that action was unnecessary, impossible, or someone else's responsibility. And this is where the reflection becomes personal. When we study the silence surrounding past injustices, we are not only studying them, we are being warned. The warning is simple. Do not assume you would have acted differently unless you are already preparing yourself to act now. Moral courage is not born suddenly in dramatic moments. It is cultivated slowly through small daily choices, choosing honesty over convenience, empathy over indifference, truth over popularity. These quiet habits determine who we become when larger tests arrive. There is also a spiritual lesson embedded here. Many religious and ethical traditions teach that witnessing injustice creates responsibility. To see suffering and ignore it is not neutrality, it is a moral position. Silence, in this sense, is never empty. It either protects the vulnerable or protects the Arabic. Thought Arabic, glam Arabic, meme against them. Recognizing this transforms the way we understand our role in the world. We are not merely observers of history. We are participants in shaping what future generations will remember about us. At the same time, confronting silence should not lead to despair. The same history that records indifference also records courage, individuals and communities who refused to remain quiet, who spoke when it was dangerous, who protected others when it was unpopular. Their numbers were sometimes small, but their moral impact was immense. They remind us that even limited courage can interrupt great Arabic, thought Arabic, glam Arabic, meme, and that one principled voice can awaken many silent ones. So, the lesson before us is both heavy and hopeful. Heavy because it reveals how easily humanity can fail its own ideals. Hopeful because it shows that failure is never the only option. Each generation receives another chance to choose differently, to listen sooner, to care more deeply, to act more bravely. And perhaps this is the question we must carry with us when the next moment of injustice appears, and history assures us it will. Will we be among those who waited for others to speak, or among those who refused to let silence become part of the story? As we move forward in this reflection, another dimension of the story begins to appear, one that is often overshadowed by narratives of suffering and displacement. While much attention is rightly given to hardship, there exists another reality running alongside it: contribution. The same communities that endured exile, silence, and uncertainty also participated deeply in the shaping of civilization. And this coexistence of struggle and contribution reveals something profound about the human spirit. It is easy to assume that creativity, scholarship, and innovation flourish only in conditions of stability and power. Comfort seems like the natural soil for intellectual growth, yet history repeatedly challenges this assumption. Some of the most enduring contributions to philosophy, ethics, science, literature, and commerce emerged not from security, but from vulnerability. When survival cannot depend on dominance, it often turns toward understanding. When material certainty is fragile, attention shifts to knowledge, meaning, and moral reflection. In this way, hardship does not merely wound, it can also refine. But to recognize contribution honestly, we must look beyond stereotypes and simplified praise. The goal is not to romanticize achievement or to reduce an entire people to a list of accomplishments. Rather, it is to understand the deeper psychological pattern that makes sustained contribution possible even under pressure. What allows a community facing exclusion to continue investing in learning? What motivates individuals living with uncertainty to pursue excellence that may benefit societies that do not fully accept them? These questions lead us towards something deeper than history. They lead us toward character. One answer lies in the power of intellectual tradition. When learning becomes sacred, it survives external instability. Books can be carried when land is lost. Ideas can travel where borders restrict movement. Teaching the next generation becomes an act of resistance against disappearance. In such an environment, knowledge is no longer merely practical. It becomes existential. To study is to preserve identity. To think is to remain alive in history. Over centuries, this produces cultures where scholarship is not a luxury, but a necessity. There is also a moral dimension to contribution born from suffering. Those who know vulnerability intimately often develop heightened sensitivity to justice, ethics, and human dignity. This does not happen automatically, and history shows that pain can lead in many directions. Yet when suffering is processed through faith, discipline, and reflection, it can generate compassion rather than cruelty, responsibility rather than resentment. Contributions to moral philosophy and social thought frequently emerge from precisely this tension: the desire to build a world more just than the one inherited. Another important element is adaptability. Communities that survive across many lands must learn to navigate different languages, economies, and political systems. This constant adjustment cultivates flexibility of mind and creativity in problem solving. Over time, such skills naturally extend into fields like trade, science, medicine, and cultural exchange. What begins as a strategy for survival gradually becomes a channel for influence. And often, this influence is quiet, woven into institutions, ideas, and discoveries that shape daily life without always revealing their origins. Yet, here we encounter a paradox. Contributions that become deeply integrated into society are sometimes the easiest to overlook. When an idea becomes universal, its source fades from attention. When knowledge spreads widely, the memory of who preserved it can disappear. This is one way chapters of history become lost, not through denial but through absorption. The very success of contribution can make it invisible. Recognizing this invisibility is part of restoring historical balance and moral honesty. At the same time, acknowledging contribution should expand our sense of shared human heritage rather than divide it. Civilization is never the product of a single people. It is a tapestry woven from countless cultures, each offering insight shaped by unique trials and hopes. When we study any one thread carefully, we begin to appreciate the complexity of the whole. This awareness challenges narrow thinking and invites humility. None of us inherit the world alone. We inherit it together. For the present moment, this reflection carries urgent relevance. We live in an age where identities are often discussed in terms of conflict: who belongs, who threatens, who deserves recognition. In such an atmosphere, remembering histories of contribution changes the conversation. It reminds us that communities frequently known through headlines of tension also carry legacies of knowledge, creativity, and moral thought. Seeing this fuller picture does not erase disagreement, but it restores humanity to discussions that too easily become abstract or hostile. More personally, it invites each of us to reconsider how we respond to difficulty in our own lives. If creativity and service can emerge from centuries of instability, then our individual hardships need not end in despair. They can become sources of depth, empathy, and purpose. The scale is different, but the principle is the same. Adversity can either close the heart or expand it. Contribution begins at the moment we choose expansion. And perhaps this is the quiet lesson hidden within these overlooked histories, that the true measure of a people is not only what they endured, but what they gave while enduring. Suffering may shape the story, but contribution defines its meaning. Hardship may write the questions, but generosity writes the answers. So, as we continue forward, the reflection becomes deeply personal. Each of us in our own limited sphere participates in the same choice history presents to entire civilizations. Will our struggles make us smaller, or will they become the reason we give more to the world than we received? As these reflections unfold, the distance between past and present begins to feel smaller than we might expect. What first appeared to be a historical exploration slowly reveals itself as something far more immediate. The patterns we have been discussing, exile, silence, resilience, contribution, do not belong only to earlier centuries. They are alive in the tensions, conflicts, and moral struggles of our own time. And this realization shifts the purpose of history from observation to responsibility. One of the most dangerous assumptions any generation can make is the belief that it is fundamentally different from those that came before it. We tell ourselves that we are more informed, more connected, more morally aware. We point to technology, global communication, and international institutions as proof that humanity has progressed beyond the injustices of the past. Yet when we look honestly at the world around us, we still see displacement, prejudice, exclusion, and the quiet normalization of suffering that does not directly affect us. The forms may change, but the underlying human tendencies remain remarkably consistent. This is why forgotten or overlooked histories matter so deeply. They function as mirrors, revealing patterns we might otherwise deny. When we study communities that faced marginalization or misunderstanding, we begin to recognize similar dynamics in contemporary society, sometimes directed at different groups in different places. Under different political narratives, the names change, the languages change, but the emotional architecture of fear and division often stays the same. History, in this sense, is not behind us. It is repeating its questions in new forms. There is also a psychological comfort in treating injustice as something distant. When suffering belongs to the past, we can mourn it without being challenged by it. When it belongs to the present, it demands a response. It asks us to evaluate our own choices, our own silences, our own willingness to see complexity rather than slogans. This is why serious engagement with history can feel unsettling. It removes the illusion of neutrality. It reminds us that every society, including our own, is capable of both compassion and cruelty, sometimes at the same time. But within this discomfort lies an opportunity. If patterns can repeat, they can also be interrupted. Awareness creates the possibility of change. When we recognize early signs of division, language that dehumanizes, narratives that simplify entire peoples, policies that quietly exclude, we gain the chance to respond before harm becomes irreversible. This is one of the greatest gifts history offers, not certainty about the future, but sensitivity to warning signs. At the same time, applying historical lessons to the present requires humility. The world today is complex, shaped by political realities, competing truths, and deeply rooted grievances. Simple comparisons rarely capture the full picture. Responsible reflection does not mean forcing the past onto the present, but allowing the past to sharpen our moral perception. It teaches us to ask better questions. Who is being unheard? Who is being reduced to a symbol instead of recognized as human? What suffering are we learning to ignore because acknowledging it would require sacrifice? These questions move history from the realm of information into the realm of ethics. And ethics, by definition, demands action, not always dramatic action, not always public action, but sincere action within our sphere of influence. Speaking with fairness when others speak with hostility. Seeking understanding where others settle for assumption. Defending dignity even when it is inconvenient. These choices may appear small, yet history consistently shows that large injustices depend on the accumulation of small indifferences. The opposite is also true. Meaningful change often begins with quiet integrity. Another lesson for our time is the importance of shared humanity across difference. When societies become polarized, memory itself can divide, each group remembering only its own pain, forgetting the suffering of others. This selective memory deepens conflict rather than healing it. A more honest engagement with history expands empathy instead of narrowing it. It allows us to grieve suffering wherever it appears without needing it to belong to our own identity first. Such empathy is not weakness, it is moral clarity, and perhaps this is where the reflection becomes most urgent. We are living in an era where information is constant, but wisdom is scarce, where opinions spread faster than understanding, where outrage is easier than compassion. In such a world, remembering deeply rather than reacting quickly becomes a form of resistance. It slows us down enough to see people instead of categories, stories instead of slogans, humanity instead of headlines. So the question is no longer what history meant for those who lived it, but what it will mean for us. Will it remain a collection of stories we analyze from a safe distance, or will it become guidance that shapes how we speak, judge, and act in the present? The answer is not decided in classrooms or speeches alone. It is decided in daily moments of choice, often unseen by anyone except our own conscience. And this leads us to a final, sobering realization. Future generations will study our time just as we study the past. They will ask what we noticed, what we ignored, what we defended, and what we allowed to continue. Our present will become their history. Our silence or courage will become their lesson. So perhaps the most honest question we can leave with is this: when our era becomes someone else's chapter in history, will it be remembered for repeating old divisions, or for finally learning how to rise above them? As we arrive at the final reflection, everything we have discussed begins to gather into a single, pressing idea: the responsibility of remembering. Not remembering as a passive act of storing information, but remembering as a moral choice that shapes who we become and how we live. Because in the end, the question is not only what history contains, but what we decide to carry forward from it. Throughout our journey, we have seen how stories can be forgotten, how exile can test identity, how silence can enable injustice, how contribution becomes invisible, and how the past continues to echo within the present. All of these themes lead naturally to this final point: memory is not neutral. To remember is to honor, to forget is sometimes unintentionally to abandon, and societies are ultimately defined not just by what they achieve, but by what they choose never to forget. There is a deep psychological truth here. Human beings cannot hold every story with equal weight, so we select the memories that shape our collective identity. We build monuments to certain events, teach specific histories to our children, and repeat particular narratives in public life. These choices quietly communicate what we value. When suffering is remembered, dignity is affirmed. When resilience is remembered, hope is strengthened. But when pain is erased or ignored, something within the moral fabric of society begins to weaken. This is why remembering must go beyond emotion. Feeling sadness about past injustice is natural, but emotion alone fades quickly. Moral memory, by contrast, transforms feeling into responsibility. It asks, what does this history require from me now? Without that question, remembrance becomes ceremony rather than change. With it, remembrance becomes a force capable of shaping the future. There is also a spiritual dimension to memory that many traditions emphasize: the idea that forgetting truth leads to repeating harm. Not because history is destined to repeat mechanically, but because human nature remains vulnerable to the same fears, ambitions, and prejudices across generations. Memory acts as a safeguard against these tendencies. It reminds us where unchecked power leads, where indifference leads, where dehumanization leads. In this sense, remembrance is a form of protection, not only for the victims of the past, but for the conscience of the present. Yet true remembrance is demanding. It requires honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. It may require acknowledging suffering that does not fit neatly into our preferred narratives. It may ask us to feel empathy beyond the boundaries of our own community. And perhaps most difficult of all, it may require us to change, because genuine memory refuses to let us remain the same. But within this difficulty lies hope. The very act of remembering across generations proves that moral awareness can survive time. That dignity can outlive oppression. That truth, even when buried, has a way of returning to the surface. Every preserved story is evidence that darkness never fully succeeds in silencing light. And this realization should not only comfort us, it should mobilize us. Because remembrance, if sincere, always leads to action. Not necessarily grand public gestures, but steady ethical living. It shapes how we treat the vulnerable, how we speak about those different from us, how seriously we take injustice even when it is distant. Memory becomes visible through character. The past reveals itself in the present through the choices of those who claim to honor it. There is also a generational trust involved. We inherited memories we did not personally experience, stories of suffering, courage, faith, and survival. Previous generations carried them carefully so they would not disappear. Now that trust passes to us, The question is whether we will preserve these memories with the same sincerity, or allow distraction and comfort to erode them. Forgetting rarely happens suddenly, it happens slowly through neglect, and this brings us to a quiet but profound realization: remembering is ultimately an act of justice. It restores voice to those who can no longer speak. It refuses to let Arabic, thought Arabic, lam Arabic, meme have the final word. It declares that every human story mattered, even if the world once ignored it. In doing so, remembrance transforms the past from a place of tragedy into a source of guidance. But guidance only matters if it is followed. History does not change the world by being written, it changes the world by being lived. The lessons we have explored about endurance, courage, contribution, empathy, and responsibility are meaningful only if they reshape our daily conduct. Otherwise, even the most powerful history becomes Arabic, meme Arabic, jim Arabic, rot Arabic, dal Arabic, kaf Arabic, lam Arabic, meme Arabic, alif Arabic, ta, words without weight. So as we close this reflection, the final message is both simple and demanding. We are not only readers of history, we are its next authors. The memories we preserve, the injustices we challenge, the dignity we defend, these will become the legacy others inherit after us. And perhaps this is the thought we should carry forward. A forgotten past endangers the future, but a remembered past can illuminate it. The choice between those two paths is not made by nations alone. It is made quietly within each human heart every time we decide whether memory will remain a story we heard or become a responsibility we live.